Hello and welcome to our first class as we start our new study in the book of Ecclesiastes. As we do this study, we are going to be using the workbook published by Mike Willis and Dan King, as they gave us some ideas to look at relative to this portion of the wisdom of Solomon being shared with us in this particular book. So today we're beginning our very first lesson, the introductory lesson to the story of what is revealed by Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes. In looking at some of the background of the book, there are some who would like to challenge the authorship of the book and say that it was written by somebody way on down the line, and he just used Solomon's name to justify his writing the book and to give it some degree of credibility. Such a viewpoint, from my perspective, is totally misplaced because it makes it appear as though the Bible is asking us to accept a lie or a forgery, to accept something that was supposedly written by Solomon but really wasn't written by Solomon. I think the evidences that we'll find throughout this text are going to give us ample evidence to put complete faith and trust in the fact that this work that we are studying, the book of Ecclesiastes, is indeed from the pen and the dictation of King Solomon himself. Whenever we look at the name of the book, I find that rather interesting. And if we look at the first question in the introductory lesson in our workbook, it says, how did the book get its name and what does its name mean? Well, if you look to the very first verse of the book of Ecclesiastes, it says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Whenever the Bible was translated from its original Hebrew format in the Old Testament over to the Greek translation, changing it from one language to another, the Greeks picked up on this term preacher and they gave it a term called Ecclesiastes, which was referencing the literal meaning to mean a preacher or one who speaks in the assembly. And so in the Septuagint version, which was the Greek writing of the Old Testament, the Greek translation of it, Ecclesiastes is the name given in reference to the preacher who is documented as the author of this particular book. Then, whenever the Bible was translated from the ancient Greek language and looking also to the Hebrew and going on over to the English that we would read today, the term Ecclesiastes just stuck as the word that meant the preacher, and it is a documentary then, or a documentation of the writing of King Solomon. So that's how we come by that rather unusual name. It comes to us through the Greek as a reference to the word preacher. In question 2, it says, what facts does the author of the book reveal about himself? Now, this becomes significant as we identify its authorship. If we look here to the very first verse, it says that this is the words of the preacher, the son of David. So here we find some documentation as to the fact that the author was indeed David's son, which would qualify as Solomon in this particular case. He goes on to say that he was king in Jerusalem. So this puts him as a king during the time when the empire or the kingdom was united together. Jerusalem was its capital city. Even though later kings would follow on that throne, none of them reflects anything near the kind of wisdom that is shown by the author of this book. Down in verse 16 of this same first chapter, the author says, I commuted with mine own heart, saying, Lo, I am come to great estate, and I have gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. So we understand from this declaration as well that Solomon was that wise man. And we'll talk a little bit later in the lesson about the source of all of his great wisdom. But he also affirms in this first chapter and in verse 16 that he was a very wealthy individual. He said, I was come to great estate. And if we look at some of the writings in the record given in the Kings and Chronicles about the wealth of Solomon, it is staggering to see the kind of revenue that this man had access to. Going down in chapter 2, beginning in verse 7, he says, I got me servants and maidens, and I had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle, above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold, and peculiar treasure of kings and of provinces. I gat me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. So I was great, and increased more than all they that were before me in Jerusalem, and also my wisdom remained with me. So Solomon here affirms the great wealth, that he was a man of power, he was a man of great financial means. And he also mentions the fact that he was the architect of many great construction projects. Here in the second chapter, beginning in verse 4, he said, I made me great works. I builded me houses. I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards, and I planted trees in them of all kinds of fruit. I made me pools of water to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. So here he talks about many of the things that he engineered, many of the things that he had constructed. So all of these references fit beautifully into the profile of the true King Solomon that we read about in the Old Testament. In question 3, it says, list the known facts about Solomon, which were from a strictly earthly point of view, would cause men to listen to what he has to say. Well, whenever we look at these passages that we've noted, he rises to the level of being somebody who would be admired, somebody that you would want to listen to. He says here in verse 12, I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. Here is a person of power, somebody who has attained greatness, somebody who has prestige, and many people will turn to listen to that kind of a teacher. Also, he was a person of great reputation. Remember the story from 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 through 7, where the Queen of Sheba had heard of the great wisdom of Solomon and came to witness it firsthand, and walked away saying that while she'd heard great things about him, the half had not been told. So here is somebody who exhibited his wisdom, and that wisdom was carried to either other corners of the world, as folks talked about how wise Solomon was. So he had the reputation where people would seek him out. They wanted to observe his wisdom. They wanted to see how he did things. Remember the story of the two women that argued over the child that was still living in their household. One had died, one baby was still alive, and one woman was claiming it was her child, and the other said, no, it's my child. And Solomon said, well, just cut the baby in half. You can each have a piece. And the real mother was the one who said, no, 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 give the baby to her rather than have it killed. And Solomon, by tapping in to that maternal love and instinct, said, this is the woman who is the rightful mother of this child. So wisdom followed Solomon. It's displayed in his decision making over and over again. So it makes him a person that we would want to follow after. Remember there in verse 16, I commune with mine own heart, saying, lo, I am come to great estate, have gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. Solomon was a qualified teacher. He was someone you would want to listen to, somebody that you would respect and want to see the wisdom that he could share. And then, of course, as we've also noted, he was a person of great wealth and success. He has the fruit on the tree, so to speak. He has all of these attributes going for him: power, reputation, wisdom, and he handles it well. And so individuals wanted to come see his success, see the things that he had attained, and to see the things that he was able to enjoy. So those characteristics, even today, would make us take a second look at such a teacher and want to investigate more closely the wisdom that they had to share. In question 4, it says, compare and contrast Solomon and Job as they were qualified to comment on life based upon their different life experiences. Well, if we think about Solomon, he grew up as the son of King David. He grew up in a life that would have been somewhat privileged and blessed from his earliest childhood. And so he winds up then being blessed of God with wisdom and moving on to greatness. So we see the potential of developing yourself correctly, being blessed of God, and being able to benefit both personally and to share with others the wisdom that you have. Job was also blessed at the outset of the book. Here is a man who is blessed with tremendous wealth and has a great family. But all of that is taken away from him. And Job goes through a period of being terribly deprived and stricken. Even his health was impaired with the boils that he had to endure. He had witnesses or friends who came to him and they told him all the wrong stuff, gave him more blame and more grief and more guilt by the things that they said. But Job remained steadfast in his faith in God, and eventually then was rewarded with greatness again by the time you get to the end of the book of Job. While the routes of these two men are different, we find that there is a common theme through both, and that was their trust in God. The realization that they themselves were not wonderful and they themselves had all of this ability and they have earned all these blessings, but rather they acknowledged that God was the source of all of those things. In question 5, it says, explain the meaning of the phrase, vanity of vanities. Solomon uses this phrase in the very second verse of Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. The word vanity comes from a word that carries with it the idea of a vapor, something that comes for a little time and then passes away. We might relate it to the idea of something that is of fleeting value, some insight and some profit that is gained, but it's only of fleeting value, especially when it's compared to the eternal. Man's not saying he's as smart as God. Solomon's not saying he has every answer to every question. He makes some valid observations of what goes on in life. But through all of this, he helps us to understand what are the true riches of this life, what is man's ultimate goal, and how is he going to get there. And so when he looks at life, if we only look at the here and now and the stuff that we go through and the things that are wrong in this life, then truly it all appears to be vanity. It's very empty. It takes us nowhere. We go through our life cycle and then we die, and another generation comes up and goes through the very same maneuvers. They make many of the very same mistakes. They grow old and they die, and then it's repeated again. So when you just isolate life to a set of patterned behavior, eventually it does have very little meaning and substance to it. But when it fits into the bigger picture of the fact that we're here for a little time, then this vanishes away, but our soul goes back to the God that gave it. Now that adds a whole new dimension as to why we are here and what is our duties to perform while we are here. So in question 6, he says, in what sense are all things vanity? Well, they're vanity in the sense that they are temporary. The wealth that we have, the reputation that we have, the success that we have, it only lasts for a little while. And then we vanish away. We simply fade into the memories of the past, and so it's not anything of long-lasting true value. So in that sense, all that we put forth is going to come to naught eventually. Generations 5 or 6 on down the road may not even remember our names and what families we came from. So we find that there is the vanity. That's the temporary, the worthlessness of it all, in that it doesn't make the lasting mark forever and ever that we might like to think. In question 7, he says, define under the sun in verse 3. He said, what profit hath a man of all of his labor which he taketh under the sun? Well, here he's talking about that endless cycle of our earthly existence. The sun goes up, the sun goes down. We go through night, and then it starts all over again the next day. The sun goes up and the sun goes down. And there are certain habits and rituals that we will go through each day. We have to have our meals. There are certain things we choose to do. We need a good night's sleep. There are certain things that just go on and on and on in repetitive manner all the days of our lives. But what happens while we are under the sun? Solomon talks about many of the choices that we make during the days that we have, and all these labors that we put forth under the sun during this endless cycle of events. In question 8, he said, what things does Solomon list to show man's insatiable appetite? Well, one of the things that man will seek after is a degree of wisdom and understanding. He wants to learn something about his world and how can he use it to his advantage. Here in the first chapter, going down to verse 12, it says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done, and a heaven that and under heaven, and a sore travail that God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. So he says, I was here and I gave myself to wisdom. Like some people today would decide, I want to give myself to education. And they become basically professional students all their lives, studying and learning and studying and learning. And so some will choose to do that, and that's what they will chase after all the days of their life. But in verse 18, in verses 17 and 18, he says, I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is vexation of spirit. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. The more we know, the more we realize that we don't know. And we find all those unlearned facts, that's never going to be a well that we can fill. There's always going to be shortcomings, and often when the things that we learn dispel some of our preconceived notions and may bring us discouragement and dismay. And so knowledge and the seeking after knowledge is a two-edged sword. It can be of tremendous benefit, but it can also be bittersweet in that it also helps us to expose some things that are less than the perfect imaginations that we had. In the second chapter, he talks about giving oneself over to self-indulgence and just doing everything that you want to do, seeking after happiness through carnal means. Here in the first verse of the second chapter, I said in mine heart, go to now, and I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, and behold, this also is vanity. He said, I went after all kinds of things to make me laugh and to make me have a good time, and all of those things that were looked at as pleasurable. But those wonderful moments were but fleeting as well. Going down to verse 11, he talked here about what he had, and he said, then I looked at all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. Living it up did not make him feel fulfilled. It did not make him feel worthwhile. It did not give him the satisfaction that one might think that it would. And then as he continues on in this second chapter, he talks about the vanity of living wisely, that we see ourselves as highly educated and that we know great mysteries, and that should suffice to help us feel superior and content. But he says in verse 12 of the second chapter, I turn myself to behold wisdom, and madness and folly. For what can the man do that cometh after the king? Even that which hath already been done. And then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly, as far as light excelleth darkness. He said, am I going to live a stupid life, living foolishly and making self-indulgent choices and foolish choices that only bring me to ruin? Well, no. I can choose to follow a wise course. But if I follow a wise course and do goodly things all my days, it's still going to come to naught when I die. It's not going to give me that feeling of I've attained and I know it all. We're never going to reach that. And so that pursuit of knowledge endlessly was not going to supply all of man's needs and fulfillments either. And then also in the second chapter, in verse 18, he talked about the vanity of work. Now, here again, in each one of these situations, he's not saying that wisdom is ridiculous, that self indulgence is something that should never occur, or that living wisely is a bad choice. He's just saying that in the grand scheme of things, they are not the end of it all. And that's not the ultimate goal as to why we are here. And so he says the same thing for work. Being a workaholic is not going to give you that ultimate fulfillment. In the second chapter, in verse 18, yea, I hated all of my labor which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it to the man that shall be after me. It's that I can accumulate great things. I can do all kinds of wonderful things. But whenever it's all said and done, it's just going to go to somebody else. And who knows whether he's going to treat it correctly or whether he's going to waste and destroy all that I have worked so hard to build. And so he says in verse 26 of the second chapter, for God giveth to a man that is good in his sight, wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he giveth travail, to gather and to heap up, that he may give to him that is good before God. This also is vanity and vexation of spirit. He makes the point that there's a place for honest toil, and there's going to be rewards that come from that. But if we let that become our obsession, where we live in greed and covetousness, we'll never be satisfied. We'll chase after the dollar every day that we live, and then one day it will all go to somebody else. So in question 9, he says, what is the profit of man's labor? Well, going back to verse 3 of the first chapter, he asked that question, what profit hath a man of all of his labor which he taketh under the sun? Well, as we notice here in the second chapter, he makes the point that it's not lasting. It's not going to give us anything of permanence. In the second chapter, in verse 18 beginning, yea, I hated all of my labor which I taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me. And whoso knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool, yet shall he have rule over all of my labor, wherewith I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. For there is a man who laboreth, for there is a man whose labor is in wisdom and in knowledge and in equity. Yet to a man that hath not labored therein shall he leave it for his portion. This is also vanity and a great evil. For what hath man of all of his labor, and of the vexation of his heart, wherein he hath labored under the sun? For all his days are sorrows, and his travail grief. Yea, his heart taketh not rest in the night. This also is vanity. So there's not going to be any true satisfaction that we're going to get from our work. That we just worked hard all of our lives, and then we died. That's not going to make us feel absolutely wonderful. That's where we devoted our time and effort, but now we leave it all behind. Back over in the first chapter in verse 8, Solomon said, all things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. So these things might bring enjoyment in this life. And God's gifts can supply us with the necessities that we need and the wisdom that we need so that our life is bearable here, that we do have good moments. Solomon summarizes it a little bit better in the second chapter in verse 24 beginning. There is nothing better for a man than he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw, that it was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who else can hasten thereunto more than I? For God giveth to a man that is good in his sight, wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he giveth travail to gather and to keep up, that he may give it to him that is good before God. This also is vanity and vexation of spirit. We're not here just to accumulate the wealth. But while we're in the journey here, we can have a sweet rest, a certain sense of self-satisfaction from a job well done. We have enjoyable moments that we are able to attain for ourselves, And so there are, as we look at question 9 and part A, there are some benefits in our labor. We have a feeling of self-worth, that there are some things that we can do. We're able to supply the necessities of life for ourselves and for our families. There are options of joy that we are able to enjoy as we labor here below. So there is a value to labor. It's just not something that is an end all, or that should be the only joy and focus of our lives. And in part B, the author asks, in what sense is it vanity? How is it that all of this work and all of this labor eventually comes to naught? Well, like we've said, it's left to others who may waste it foolishly. And as we seek after these things, it will make our lives hard. Whenever we're slaving away day in and day out, 7 days a week, we work hard, but for something that we're just going to leave behind. In question 10, what things mark the endless, monotonous cycle of nature? When we think about what happens over and over and over again, as we've mentioned, we have days that follow days. The weather constantly repeats itself. It goes through seasonal changes. We begin to see certain things that happen just over and over and over again. But God made those cycles for a purpose, and He placed us in that cycle so that we can attain our potential as we go through this life. In question 11, it says, what similarities do you see between the motion without progress in nature and in the human existence? So nature is going around. Sun goes up, sun goes down, sun goes up, sun goes down. Season follows season, year after year after year. It's almost like that repetitive cycle doesn't get you anywhere. It just keeps you rolling. I think about a gerbil that one of our kids had as a pet, and it would jump into a wheel and just run and run and run and run and spend a great deal of time spinning that wheel, but they never really got anywhere. And sometimes that's what happens to us in this life. We just spin our wheels. We really don't make a whole lot of real progress. We just put in our time. Solomon accounts for the fact that that is a reality. It happens. There are those moments in our lives when we feel less than productive, and even at our best, there is a cap on how far we can go and how great we can be. We only have so much potential to tap into. But with God, it's amazing how that potential may be much greater than what we first give it credit for. He talks about the limitations of what we can do with what we see and hear over there in that first chapter and going down to verse 8. When he said, all things are full of labor, and man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. We don't see enough to be satisfied. There's always something else we want to look at, another book that we want to read, another site that we want to see. There's something else that we need to hear. Maybe we want to have a replay of that play that we just saw in the sports arena. We want to keep listening. What did you say? I didn't quite get it the first time. We sometimes see, but we don't see. We hear, and we don't hear. So we have our limitations, and we're constantly working with those things. And that's what he asks in the latter part of question 12. Give some examples of this from your own life. We love to watch replays in sports. How many times do we ask our spouse, what did you say? I didn't hear you. As a school teacher, we repeated instructions over and over and over again. We gave directions over and over and over again. And some areas of instruction we would teach and reteach and reteach, because certain people at that moment were not listening or receiving what we had to say. And so, once again, the cycle of instruction had to be repeated. So our lives are not just one continuous progression. We start here, we build on that, we build on that, we build on that, we build on that. It's more like a saw blade. We go up and then we slide back. We go up and down and up and down and up and down. And we keep hoping that the highs get a little bit higher as we attain more wisdom experience. And at the same time, maybe our dips in the valleys are a little bit less because we're growing and profiting from it. But as a result of these efforts, we simply go through our cycles here, being the best that we can be. Solomon is putting perspective and a framework to his discussion. He's helping us to understand there are strengths and weaknesses in this life that we live. This wasn't intended for us to be our permanent residence forever, and there's something far better than this. And so Solomon is helping us to understand we shouldn't get too comfortable here, that this isn't all that there is. And then he goes on to mention, as we notice here in verse 11 of the first chapter, he said, "There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of the things that are to come after those that shall come after." He said, what will be, in question 13, what will become of man's memory? Well, eventually we will be forgotten. The things that we've learned over time, we will forget. All of it comes and it goes. That's the cycle of man's existence. And if we have no goal, if there is no ultimate objective that we are striving for, then this becomes a very futile exercise. Life becomes a drag. There doesn't seem to be any purpose, and hopelessness fills our days. Now, Solomon's going to help us to address that as he goes farther through this narrative. But we're going to see and learn some things about where real wisdom comes from and what our real job is here on this earth as we put things in perspective. And I hope that you'll join us next week as we continue with our introduction to the book of Ecclesiastes.